Now, just as a quick reminder, March 31st, 2023 is the deadline for submitting your HOME-ARP allocation plan to HUD. That's a Friday. And remember that IDIS closes, it's a hard stop at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. All right, so folks over on the West Coast, that's going to be 7 o'clock, and our friends over in Alaska, that's going to be 6 o'clock. And then farther west, out in the Pacific Ocean, that's going to be earlier. So please keep that deadline in mind, okay? And good luck. And I'll turn it back over to Jessica. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Kim. And so we just want to highlight a couple of resources that are available to you as you're going through your allocation plan. We do have an AAQ help desk, which is available where you can ask questions related to the allocation plan. And I'm going to put that in the chat for you so you can kind of have that available in the event that you need any, if you have any questions. And then also if you have any questions that are not related to the allocation plan, but more about implementation or any other kinds of questions that are HOME-ARP related, you can also reach out to the HUD team, and I will put their email in here as well. So, okay. The next thing that we want to just turn your attention to is the HOME-ARP page on the HUD Exchange. There's a number of resources available, tools, handouts, fact sheets, tips and tricks for you to help you get your allocation plan in on time. And so we want to just point that to everyone. And again, I'll put that in the chat so you have that direct link to take you straight to that page. And lastly, we have resources by topic. So there's some general allocation planning topics. So tips on using the allocation plan template, any common issues that are related to allocation plans that have been submitted thus far. There's also the allocation plan review checklist. This is a great resource. This is what the HUD team is using when they're looking at your allocation plans to ensure that you have everything that's required. And then there are some specific things on consultation, public participation, needs assessments and gaps analysis, the various activities and preferences, limitations, and referral methods. And we'll make sure to put these links in the chat as we go, since you're not able to kind of click on them on this page. But now what we're going to do is really get into the question part of this. And so if anyone has specific questions, wants to be our very first person to ask, would love to hear from you. Otherwise, we had a few questions that we got through the registration process that can kind of get us started. But again, if you are wanting to come off mute and ask them, just drop that in the chat. Let us know you'd like to ask it. Or you can put your question in the chat and I will make sure to read it aloud so our group can answer them for you. So do we have anybody that's wanting to come off mute and ask us a question just to get us started? Okay, well, we got one in the chat already, so I'm going to go ahead and read it off to the group. And so this particular PJ is planning on using coordinated entry process for their HOME-ARP funds. Their question is, if an agency applies for funds, but their current program gives a preference to chronic homelessness, is this allowable?
Yeah, I had to find my mute button. Can you reread the question? I want to make sure that I understand.
Absolutely. So this PJ is looking to use coordinated entry for using HOME-ARP funds. And their question is, if an agency applies for funds, but their current program gives a preference to chronically homeless, is this allowable?
So it's allowable if you identify that preference in your allocation plan. So what you want to make sure that you're doing is, if you are expecting that will have applications from organizations who are operating programs that have preferences in this way, that you're outlining them in your allocation plan and identifying them early on. If you don't identify them in your allocation plan and then you fund them, then you would be in violation of your allocation plan. You could do a substantial amendment later on, but if you kind of part of the consultation process is understanding what the needs are in the community and starting to identify potential partners under your HOME-ARP program. So if you are getting a sense that that might come up, you could identify that in your allocation plan. You also want to take into consideration, is it a preference or is it a limitation? The programs that you're expecting to apply, are they going to be accessible to all QPs, or would they limit access to only chronically homeless? In which case it would be potentially a limitation, but you also want to think about your HOME-ARP program, your umbrella program. So all of your funding, the requirement is that under your HOME-ARP program, you are providing access to all QPs. So if one project or specific supportive services, for example, project is limited to a certain subpopulation, or you have a preference, that's okay, as long as your overarching HOME-ARP program is accessible to all QPs. George, anything you want to jump in there on?
Hey everyone, it's George. Thanks, Elisa. You mentioned this, but I think I would just add stress to, like, if you're going to have a preference, you want that preference to really be substantiated by your needs assessment and gaps analysis. So you shouldn't be instituting a preference just because one of your providers says this is who they usually serve. You need to be showing that, you know, that particular QP or subpopulation of the QP has a particular unmet need, or there isn't a service available to them. So that's why you're instituting the preference.
Hi, and can I just jump in too? This is Kim again. Also, just remember that, you know, the person who posted the question talked about coordinated entry. And so please remember that for HOME-ARP, you will need to work with the COC to expand coordinated entry so that it can accept all 4 QPs, or have an understanding that referrals will come through other methods, as we state in the notice. And I know that we've got some good guidance on how to navigate through those 3 different referral methods, but coordinated entry inherently implements preference, right? And it is for the chronically homeless in many COCs. And that's totally fine, but it also does not assist all 4 QPs. It's just not how it's set up to be. So just want to make sure that you're keeping that in mind when you're thinking about your referral processes. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you all. I mean, you can see as we go through some of these questions, they get a little bit more complex and a little bit more of, you know, where we have multiple things that are impacting an answer. The next question that we got in our chat was about IDIS. And so we don't have probably a ton of information on that, since that's not necessarily related to the allocation plan. But I'm going to ask it anyway, if anybody has answers. If not, we'll help you kind of get pointed in the direction of some IDIS trainings on the HUD Exchange. But the question is, will activities set up in IDIS after approval of the allocation plan be subjected to a review? And that might be a good HUD team question. I think right now we're just thinking about getting things in there, but will there be a review afterwards?
I guess the question is, what does review mean? I don't know what that means. I guess, you know, if we were going to talk about, say, an action plan, you know, generally speaking, it's possible for PJs, when they're discussing their home projects and their action plan, there's not a lot of detail, right? They just might say rental housing. And then when you put stuff up in IDIS, you give a little bit more clarity. No, we wouldn't be going, we wouldn't, you know, reps would not be going back in necessarily unless, I mean, you know, they see something that's wonky and they might want to reach out, but there isn't like another review process. but you know, after the fact. But like as I said, you know, if a HUD person sees something that's a little interesting or concerning, they will certainly reach out, but no additional review, formal review. I hope that answers your question.
And I would think too, if there were some flags in IDIS, you know, as we're getting down the road, that's a time when you're going to have someone looking at them again. So similar to your other programs in IDIS, that would normally trigger someone to take a look. Perfect. So we have another question here. This is more about kind of preferences, but related to how communities are getting the word out there. So the question is, if we're planning to put out a NOFO to our local nonprofits to get projects to fund, we don't really know their individual preferences yet. So how would you handle this?
George, I'll let you jump in on this one to start, and then
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you know, Elisa mentioned this when she was responding to the first question, that as you are doing your allocation plan, doing your consultation with organizations that already serve the QPs, and then doing your needs assessment and gaps analysis, you know, you might be coming up with an idea of what possible preferences could be, and those might be making themselves known to you through your work on doing the plan. So I would just advise you to, you know, be paying attention to those conversations, paying attention to your data analysis, and see if there are any obvious preferences that might be coming to light and that you might decide to implement in your plan, because you know, you might not even know which providers you're going to fund yet, but you know that these are populations or subpopulations that really need these services. You know, at this point, if you know, you're probably submitting your plan and doing your RFP after, if you know, after it's been submitted and approved. So it might be the case that you end up having some providers or some responses to the RFP that you weren't anticipating, right? That are for projects that only serve one QP or a subpopulation of a QP, or from providers that traditionally only serve, you know, one QP or a subpopulation of a QP. And if that's the case and you decide to fund those projects, you are going to have to go back and do a substantial amendment to have those preferences. So I think this is a little bit of a dance, is what I'll say. I think people want like a really firm answer on this question, but to some degree, you know, you might end up having, if you decide after your plan has been approved that some of these projects are the ones that are most needed in your community and the providers are capable of carrying them out, then you might need to go back and do a substantial amendment to your allocation plan to institute those preferences. Elisa?
I would add that I think that there's a little bit of like an educational component. You as the PJ, you're responsible and obligated to administer the funds, right? And to be aware of how your partners are administering programs or projects that fall under your HOME-ARP umbrella. And so I think that educational process starts in the consultation, but it doesn't end there. So you're kind of working with your partners in the communities, nonprofits, developers, folks who might be coming in to apply for HOME-ARP funding, and making sure that they understand what the HOME-ARP program does, who it serves, that they understand the qualifying populations. And then I think when you're writing your application, so whatever procurement process you might utilize, you want to be clear in that RFP or NOFA that HOME-ARP is serving specific qualifying populations, and those qualifying populations, while they intersect with other populations served by other projects, while they intersect with populations that are served by other funding sources, so like COC and ESG, they're not exactly the same. There's a lot of overlap, but HOME-ARP is very specific about qualifying populations and who qualifies under each category. So you as the PJ are responsible for, you have an obligation, you're responsible for communicating that to your partners. I also think there's a little bit of, depending on what happens at the local level in your jurisdiction, there's a little bit of a negotiation process typically that occurs from when you receive applications to when you actually distribute funding. And if you receive an application for something that does not align with what you have indicated in your allocation plan, and it does not align necessarily, I mean, maybe it's close, but maybe they're indicating a preference that you as a PJ have not instituted and are not interested in instituting for your HOME-ARP program, that maybe during that negotiation period is when you're having a conversation with them and making sure that they really fully understand the parameters of your HOME-ARP program. So I think a lot of it kind of depends on how you manage things locally, but there's definitely an educational component, and you have responsibility there as the PJ, and you have the authority there. So while you do want to inform the projects that you fund and the services that you provide are informed by your partners are not making the end decision. You are.
And we have a follow-up question to that. So if we want to go ahead and have Milton come off mute, he's got a follow-up question for us.
Yeah, y'all can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, that was originally my question. And so right now, as we've got our plan out for public comment right now, as it's worded right now, what we have is that we basically do mention like our COC that we may be working with and some of the other programs, and we talk about the various preferences they may have, and we say we're going to try to, our intent is to keep things balanced and make sure everyone is served, but we're not imposing like an overall preference on the program, on our HOME-ARP program, but we're saying some of the activities might have a preference, and we'll intend to keep that balance. And I'm just wondering if that sounds like a reasonable and possibly acceptable to HUD way to handle it.
So you can definitely set preferences by activity type, but if you are doing a preference, whether it's for your HOME-ARP program, your overall umbrella program, or your activity at the activity level, you still need to identify it in your allocation plan. So that's kind of the key sticking point that I would just want to reiterate for you. I think that there is a nice balance to be found there, and I don't see necessarily anything, any red flags from that process, except that you want to make sure that you're identifying those preferences in your allocation plan. So if you're going to allow for, say, a specific activity, so say, I'm just kind of just throwing this out there, but say you were doing non-congregate shelter and you wanted it a preference to be provided for folks who are experiencing literal homelessness, so meet the first QP definition under that activity, then you need to identify that in your allocation plan.
Yeah. All right. I think that's helpful.
Good. Glad that you could get that answered. So we did have
it's scaring me, but okay.
We don't want anyone to be scared. We just, if you need to make a change, you can make a substantial amendment or an amendment. So it's, you're not locked in. Just think about kind of as you get those, if you need to make that adjustment and how you'll be doing the substantial amendment.
Thank you.
I'll make a plug now too for like if you're working on your plan, we are doing one-on-one like virtual sessions throughout February, March. So if you're kind of struggling with that might be a chance to have a TA provider or a subject matter expert take a look at what you've got written, and then they can kind of look and answer your questions specifically on your individual plan and what you've written.
And that's a great segue because we did get a question about any one-on-one assistance. And so we just wanted to highlight two opportunities. The one that Elisa just mentioned, I put in the chat how you would register for those one-on-ones. We'll be doing them over the next couple of weeks, where you can meet with the TA provider for about 45 minutes, and they'll be able to kind of look at your plan, answer any specific questions. And if you think you might need more than that, we also have opportunities for direct technical assistance, and I've put the link for that in the chat as well. And so you can, request that TA and potentially get an assigned TA provider to help you in a bit more of a one-on-one capacity.
Jessica, if I could just follow up on that, what was really we're finding helpful though too is to please reach out to your rep in your field office to let them know that you're seeking this help, because OHP, we always make sure to have the field office represented as part of that direct TA discussion, because we want to make sure everyone is up to snuff with what's going on. So definitely keep the field in the loop. And so that we can also make sure to triage those requests as they come in to make sure that we get the TA assigned to you as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Yeah. So we have a really kind of complex and dense question. And I think this is going to take all three of us, because some of it is about fair housing things. There's a little bit about preferences. I'm going to read it and then we'll kind of add it all together. So in our consultation, we heard that there was a need of lack of dedicated shelter bed space for women in particular. We included a preference for women in our initial allocation plan for non-congregate shelter, and we were advised that this would violate Fair Housing Act. We will explain that in our revision to the allocation plan, that we cannot implement a preference in the NCS for women due to the fact of that violation. We are trying to determine if a preference for non-congregate shelter is needed. We learned, hold on, let me make sure. Should we establish a preference for QP 1 and 3 for the non-congregate shelter, or could we eliminate all preferences for the non-congregate shelter and prioritize occupancy based on vulnerability? So taking into consideration health concerns, housing status, and availability. So it's dense. So we got a little bit of like fair housing stuff. So I'm happy to kind of kick off like why that initial allocation preference, or that preference is an issue. And then if we can kind of talk a little bit about, do we necessarily need preferences for non-congregate shelters, and what might that look like if you didn't have a preference established? Or if you did, would you use a method of prioritization based on housing instability? So, originally, the reason why the allocation plan came back with that was because under the Fair Housing Act, sex is a protected characteristic. And so having a non-congregate shelter that is dedicated to just women would be a violation of the Fair Housing Act. Under the HOME-ARP program, there are not the same exceptions to the Fair Housing Act that you would have under a COC or an ESG rule. And that's because it's a non-congregate sheltering situation. It's those exceptions are due to congregate settings. So that's absolutely right. You can't have a program that's going to either limit or give preference to a qualifying population based on a protected characteristic. So now I'm going to turn it back over to you all. Thoughts on sort of needing a preference in a non-congregate shelter setting, and maybe talking a little bit about methods of prioritization, especially based on vulnerability.
So I'll jump in and kind of on that method of prioritization piece, because that was what stuck out to me in the question. So what was described in the question is like potentially saying as folks apply for non-congregate shelter, we'll organize them according to like health factors or risk factors or length of time homelessness, rather than having a preference for a QP. What you've described is kind of organizing folks for access to shelter based on certain criteria or factors, that is a method of prioritization. And you can only use a method of prioritization if you have identified a preference. So it is essentially a preference. So one way to think of it is like if you were saying, we're going to set a preference for the homeless QP, and then as applications for shelter come in, we're going to organize them based on length of time homeless, chronic health factors, their safety risks, whatever those criteria may be. You want to outline them. You need to kind of think through and identify what those criteria may be. And then in your allocation plan, you need to include them and describe them. So you're both describing your preference for the homeless QP, and then your method of prioritization, which is how you will organize applications that come in for people that fall into that preference. The alternative, if you could identify a preference but not have a method of prioritization, which is where you would just say the preference is for folks who are fall into the first QP, but as applications come in, we're not going to organize them. We're just going to provide access to the non-congregate shelter based on their order of application. So that would be kind of a preference without a method of prioritization. But I want to be clear that if you have a method of prioritization, then you have a preference. And so you need to identify both in your allocation plan. You cannot have a method of prioritization and not identify a preference, because without a preference, you're essentially saying we're providing access to all QPs and they will be referred to the non-congregate shelter based on the order of their application. I know that there were a couple other kind of layers to that question, Jessica, that was the piece that I picked up on. I think you hit the fair housing piece. Are there other pieces that we need to make sure we're addressing?
So can I make one or two points? So I think that was really great. Both of your responses, I think, hit most of that. I think the one thing I would call the attention to is that HOME-ARP, we're talking about non-congregate shelter. So I think in some ways, when you were talking about the single-sex shelter was sort of the desire. I think non-congregate shelters, specifically individual rooms for households, and I think some of the concerns that providers who traditionally run congregate shelter might have. That's just a different situation with non-congregate shelter. So I think that's really important to point out. And then I think the other one to think about is, just realistically thinking about who is a non-congregate shelter going to serve, which of the QPs, right? I think you can do some thinking about that, about even if you don't have a preference, which sort of folks are going to be out seeking those services. It's not going to be from all four of the QPs in equal representation. You're really going to see some of the QPs, like the QP1, the homeless population, probably out seeking that service more. And so that might, just kind of thinking through that a little bit can help you sort of get a vision of what operating that activity might look like.
Great. So we had someone have their hand up, but there is a follow-up question from the person who asked that. So I'm gonna, if we can have Logan answer her follow-up question, or ask her follow-up question, or his follow-up question, and then we can have Bob, who's been patiently waiting with a hand raised after that.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you guys so much for that really thorough response. I think that helped me wrap my brain a little bit better around what the next steps we need to take are with respect to updating our allocation plan. Could a portion of that method of prioritization be taking into consideration other shelter space within our community? So for example, we have a really large men's shelter here in Wichita. And so women who come in and apply, for the non-congregate shelter piece, that their rating possibly on having available other shelter space would be higher because they're not able to access that bed space. I just want to make sure we're not doing something that would possibly violate fair housing, but in our community, we tend to have openings for men more so than we do for women, just because of that dedicated men's shelter.
Go ahead, George. I see. We're both kind of. I think that's
I
a
was
great
looking.
question.
I was looking to our fair housing guru Jessica to answer that one.
I mean, I think in that situation, as long as you're not limiting or putting that preference, it's a fair housing thing, like kind of how George talked about who naturally would be coming. If that's how your community is sort of naturally shaking this out, but you're not saying only women or only men, then you're not having any fair housing violations. If that's what ends up happening, because that's how your community is kind of, the people are disproportionately impacted by homelessness in your community, as long as you don't have any explicit rules that say, we're only taking women or we're only taking households with children, any of those protected characteristics, you're not violating anything. You're just kind of naturally having how it plays out in your community. Kim, did you have something to add to that?
I did as well. This is
Right.
David Jones. I think in the way the question was posed, I heard a little bit of distinctions being made around sex, and I think that what you would want to do is to speak with fair housing folks in your field office. Reach out to your field office rep and pose the question to them as you have. It's a little bit of a gray area there, and I know you said Kim was going to weigh in as well, but I think in the way the question was posed, I heard the possibility of folks getting into a bind, even with good intentions, making a call which by all appearances is only being made based around the sex of the person applying. So I would just be very, very careful of it and make sure that you define the parameters of what you want to do, and then to consult with fair housing FHEO folks that are available in the field office.
Kim, I have an additional thought, but Kim, I think you had something you were about to say.
Yeah, so I definitely I hear what everyone is saying, and one thing that I would just say is we also have the situations where, say, some advocates for the homeless men are going to be like, yo, why can't I get into that non-congregate shelter, right? So what I'm just going to say is that, in implementing this kind of thing, even if, when you chat with the fair housing folks serving Wichita and they say that it's okay within parameters, really you're going to have to watch the actual practical application of that, because it sounds definitely like there is a need for congregate shelter for women too, besides just the NCS. So there sounds like there's definitely a demand issue happening there, but you really do want to implement it very carefully and look at how it's going. So I would say, promise me that you would be a month into such a practice, you'd be looking at how it's going and to see if you need to tweak with things, because we really don't, we can't, HOME-ARP comes from home, and we're, bound to the fair housing and civil rights rules, unlike, not to the same degree or to a greater degree than some of the other HUD programs that we have that don't necessarily have to think about some of these things. But it's definitely, in my experience, this kind of project is definitely on the radar for fair housing folks. So we'll really want to think about that.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I want to just add in there for food for thought, and that I don't think I necessarily I'm not comfortable giving you like a solid answer there, because I think the fair housing folks should weigh in, your FHEO office. But one of the things that is sticking out to me is there might be a difference between saying like we are working with the partners in our community, which includes shelter partners, to ensure that access to emergency shelter is provided as needed. And so one of the considerations that you might work into your policies and procedures are, as openings or as people are referred for non-congregate shelter, you're also looking like, are we just making referrals to HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter, or are we making sure that folks have access to referrals to all of the shelter resources that are available to them? And so that I think where I'm a little bit fuzzy is I'm not sure that that falls under a method of prioritization. I think that might be like a kind of a system-wide conversation that comes out in your policies and procedures around how you're ensuring folks have access to what they need. And it's more of like a system-wide process, because in those instances, you might not need to like say for women, we're making referrals to non-congregate shelter because they don't have access in other places. Maybe the alternative to that is like when men come up on that list for shelter, they have like there's another shelter available that we can refer them to immediately because there's space available. And so you kind of just work your way through the list. So I will just kind of say that that's, I think, another layer to check in with your FHCO office on, because I'm not sure that system-wide approach necessarily falls under method of prioritization.
I know we're going to have a lot of follow-up questions to this, but Bob has been patiently waiting. And so I want to make sure that we get to his question. We'll come back to some others that were related to this kind of, fair housing. But I wanted to give Bob an opportunity. And then while we're getting him unmuted, if you want to ask a question verbally, rather than raising your hand, if you don't mind just putting something in the chat so that we can keep up with that, that would be really great. So Bob.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me lower my hand. I appreciate you getting to me. Actually, I had a couple of questions as the dialogue has been going on. There's a funding, there's a table in the template that shows HOME-ARP funding allocations, and there's a list of the various activities. We're not required to put a dollar amount in every single one of these categories. We can select one particular activity or two or three that we want to put dollars into. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. You do not need to fund every one of the eligible activities. You can fund one or multiple.
Okay, and so the one that says nonprofit capacity building, we have some of our subrecipients who've been working with it have talked about they don't have enough people to do the case management, particularly for the homeless, and to do for transitional housing, and to help them all the way, not just getting them into an emergency shelter, but helping them through transitional housing and mental health services, and just following them through an 18-month, a 12-month period to get them to sustainability. And they're asking for more staff. Is this item capacity building, nonprofit capacity building, is that open for this kind of funding for additional case managers to these nonprofits to be able to carry these services to these homeless people out further than just 60, 90 days?
There's a distinction between funding for staffing to provide services that might fall under your supportive services program. What you're describing, kind of the case management services, the housing support services, those are all eligible costs they're directly related to providing supportive services. So if you're funding those organizations with HOME-ARP dollars for supportive services, then you can use some of that money to pay for additional staffing to carry those services out. The nonprofit operating and capacity building activity is specifically around getting agencies with their like indirect costs and operating cost, like the organizational indirect cost, to help them staff up or gain the knowledge and build up the capacity in order to be able to successfully operate a HOME-ARP project for you. So it's not for them to provide services. It's not for them to expand existing projects or programs that they have. It's for them to be able to get up to speed, to be able to successfully operate a HOME-ARP project for you. So there's a little bit of a distinction there.
Okay, thank you for that. My last question is that the last HOME-ARP webinar, they made a reference to the HOME-ARP website where you could find copies of the allocation plans that have been approved. Where is that location? Because I've been looking for it and I cannot find any previously approved HOME-ARP plans on the HOME-ARP website.
I will put it in the chat for you.
Thank you.
1 minute.
And so, Bob, definitely, I just recommend you going back and looking at the CPD notice 21-10, page 67 provides some good guidance on operating capacity for nonprofits, just so you can see. And then, of course, the supportive services section goes into wonderful detail about what are eligible supportive services direct costs that can be provided. And just one thing that I want to, just as a shout out again, is remember that, you know, if you do fund a transitional housing project and then you also throw in supportive services as part of that, remember your overall program still must provide access to all 4 qualifying populations. So there may be a challenge because transitional housing is not something that's necessarily going to be something that all 4 QPs are going to be accessing. So you may want to think strategically about maybe some supportive services, like, you know, maybe short-term rental assistance, which, you know, is something that is covered under supportive services, or something of that ilk, or tenant landlord mediation services might be something to help some of those other QPs. All right.
And I put a link to the notice in the chat. So if you want to scroll back up, I put that in there. And then I just put a link to those approved allocation plans for you. So feel free to take a look at both of those resources. John, you are up next. You had put a question in the chat, but then you also wanted to come off mute. So I'm happy to read your question, or if you want to come off mute, we're happy to have you. Just let us know which one you'd prefer.
I'll come off mute. Maybe that'll make things more
Perfect.
efficient. So good afternoon. Thanks for letting us ask questions. My first I had a follow-up to the question earlier about sort of the necessity to make the funds available to all 4 QPs. And I'm frankly surprised at the beginning to hear that there were fewer than I thought folks who were putting supportive services in their allocation plans. That's where all my consultation is about supportive services. So we think we're going to do a narrowed, I should say, supportive services effort in my PJ. And do all the services have to be eligible to all QPs, or can they vary? So if an applicant comes, you were talking earlier about an applicant coming back and saying, you know, we're going to provide childcare, but it's only going to probably serve 1 or 2 QPs. Does that make sense? I'm trying to make sure that we're not getting sideways with the eligibility. That was my first question, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think the overall point, John, is that I think that maybe you're reflecting as just that the entire your HOME-ARP program, so that means all your funding has to serve all 4 QPs. So I think the situation you're describing is you might have multiple service providers who would provide services, and maybe they would be providing services to individual QPs through a preference or something like that. There's no issue with that at all, as long as all 4 QPs people in all 4 qualifying populations have some access to your HOME-ARP program.
Gotcha. Okay. And then Jessica, I had a second one in the chat. Do you want to go ahead and ask that, or you want to wait?
No, go for it. It's all yours.
If we have rental housing in our plan as well, let's say we have $250,000 toward a housing project that doesn't go forward, can we reallocate that money to supportive services, or can the dollar amounts in the budget change in our plan or after it's approved, or does that require substantial amendment?
So you can whether or not that will require a substantial amendment or not, I believe will be dependent on what your citizen participation plan says. In terms of if there is a threshold, a threshold amount, like a percentage change, in terms of what would trigger a substantial amendment. Am I right on that, colleagues?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. But also, if your citizen participation plan says if we're going to, cancel a project, right? That's what you would be doing. That could also trigger a substantial amendment. Or, if you're not going to be serving a particular population anymore. So yeah, so really kind of think about it. There might be other extenuating circumstances besides, like, say, the dollar threshold of that shift.
Thank you.
And then definitely also shout out to the notice. I think it's page 16-ish, where we talk about some of the things that definitely trigger a substantial amendment, besides what you might say in your citizen participation plan.
Yeah, moving dollar amounts within an activity, it does require an amendment, but that's a different process than the substantial amendment, and it's a much kind of more straightforward, easier process. Or I don't even want to say easier. It's just a different process. It doesn't require the same level of review as a substantial amendment.
All right. So thank you all. This is great. Continue to ask these questions. Drop them in the chat. If you are going to put them in the chat, if you can make sure that your to goes to the hosts or to everyone, and we can kind of keep up with it. But Pauline, we saw your hand raised, and then there were some additional questions in the chat. Just want to give you also the opportunity either to come off mute, or I'm happy to read them and have the group answer on your behalf, answer those for you. So just let me know which one works best for you.
I can do it verbally. The question we have is, we do have preferences listed, and we also have, what kind of projects that we're going to be supporting, but we didn't specifically say for non-congregate shelter. It was more non-congregate shelter development to serve families and eligible QPs. That was the extent of that. Now, the question I'm having is, with different aspects of what we're doing, like we have a lot in our social services, and part of that is rental assistance, and we have preferences for DV as well as seniors who have disabling, possibly with disabling conditions, who have either been evicted or facing eviction. So we have that under the services piece, but we didn't assign per se the non-congregate piece to any specific group per se. So is there an error that we made in assigning, rental assistance to the preference populations and not assigning a specific group to the development of affordable housing or the non-congregate shelter? I'm just confused. Like, did we have to do that?
No, there's certainly no requirement that you establish a preference for non-congregate shelter for any activity. Establishing a preference is optional. So you could, what you described, if I'm hearing it correctly, and folks, please feel free to jump in if you heard something different, but what I'm hearing is that you are not establishing a preference under your non-congregate shelter activity. You are establishing a preference under your supportive services activity, and that's absolutely allowable. as long as you're identifying those in your allocation plan.
Yes, and we did do that. And as far as the affordable rental housing development, again, we don't have it targeted to a particular QP. It's everyone and anyone. So, you know, because it's not enough money to really develop a project. And that's the other question I have, and I don't mean to overstay my welcome. In a community like ours, you are going to have multiple funding sources to develop an affordable rental housing project. If we are using ARP dollars under this program, and say a city is also going to contribute ARP dollars to a project, do you think there'll be conflict between those two funding sources? You know, I'm just not sure how that's going to work when you add other funding sources on top of those possible two. Or is that something I shouldn't lose sleep over?
So there could be conflict. So I'm going to use like other funding sources as an example, not just HOME-ARP. So like there could be in a development project, you could have HOME-ARP funding and then maybe LIHTC funding, which has some income restrictions. So that's allowable. That's okay, because those other resources have like kind of specific income restrictions, but even with those income restrictions, you're still serving across all QPs. What wouldn't be, well, it would be potentially allowable, what you would need to identify it as a limitation would be like if you were specifically excluding a QP from, if you had a funding source that for some reason like specifically excluded other QPs. So maybe COC funding as an example, like if you had COC funding for services that said it can only be used for chronically homeless, then that would be you'd be excluding everyone else under the other QPs, QP 2, 3, and 4, because they're not homeless. But when it comes to like development and rental housing, there will be other funding sources that have income restrictions likely because you're developing affordable housing, and that's okay. OHP, anyone, is there anything that I missed on that? I want to make sure that I know that's kind of been in conversation, and I want to make sure I express it.
Yeah, we're actually going to issue additional guidance on this. It's going to be difficult to combine home and HOME-ARP in the same unit, just because you have some conflicting unit mix issues. So we recommend that they be designated as separate units within that jointly funded project. If you have two jurisdictions both investing HOME-ARP in the project, it would be very similar, to home and how you sort of account for the units. I think I heard you say correctly, you only are thinking of 250,000 for a HOME-ARP rental. Did I hear that correctly?
Did we may have muted Pauline again. Can we unmute her? Sorry.
Because I do want to, I think it's important if you're thinking about HOME-ARP rental, any HOME-ARP units in that project, if it's jointly funded, the HOME-ARP units, they need to be compliant with all the HOME-ARP requirements through the 15-year compliance period. And given the target population that we're looking at, the QP households, it's very likely that any contribution to rent may be limited or nothing at all. So you want to make sure that you have a means of making sure that that project is financially viable through that 15-year compliance period, which is why we actually permitted the use of an operating reserve. The operating reserve is intended to help cover any deficits that are associated with those QP units. So if you are thinking about putting in a small amount of money into a rental project, Yes, you can cover, 100% of eligible costs, but you want to make sure that any QP units that you've designated in that project are viable, financially viable through that 15-year compliance period.
Yeah, we are putting in $1 million.
Oh, okay. I thought I heard something 250,000.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was a previous person, but again, that's still $1 million doesn't go far over the course of a 15-year period. So as we work on projects that are coming in for assistance in development, that's something that not only we have to take into consideration, but other communities that have HOME-ARP dollars in our county will also have to take into consideration. So thank you.
Right. And we're anticipating, some smaller jurisdictions that don't have a substantial HOME-ARP allocation, putting HOME-ARP funds into a rental project, it might be difficult just because of the sort of the large long-term sort of financial commitment that's dedicated to this project. So I think you need to think about, as a PJ, sort of given your HOME-ARP allocation, what can you do with that amount of funds? Sort of what are you good at? Is HOME-ARP rental something that you have the financial sort of wherewithal to sort of support a project through that 15-year compliance period?
Well, one of the reasons we went to the supportive services side, as far as the majority of our funding, is simply because it also provides the ability to use it for rental assistance, and
right,
the flexibility of it being used as rental assistance seems to be greater than if we had taken into consideration TBRA. TBRA has some limitations that it seemed that the supportive service rental assistance didn't have. It gave providers a little bit more flexibility, I think.
Well, this was great dialogue, and there was a lot of questions that came into the chat here. One follow-up question to what we just talked about, but then I'm going to pivot us to something different, something about coordinated entry. Just a follow-up question to what we were just talking about. We're still needing to identify specific HOME-ARP units as a subset of a development. Is that correct?
Correct. And they can be, like home, either fixed or floating. If you're putting the HOME-ARP funds into a jointly funded project with other funding sources, for example, home, you would probably want to do fixed units. So you'd have your designated home units and your designated HOME-ARP units. Because like I mentioned previously, trying to figure out sort of the unit mix. If a unit is jointly funded, it's pretty much near impossible, just very complicated. So it would be sort of, you'd want to designate fixed home units, fixed HOME-ARP units.
Perfect. I don't want anyone to panic about all the dialogue that we've been having. I just wanted to remind everyone that there are opportunities for additional one-on-one support and direct TA. So if you're new to this program, well, we're all new to the program. If you're new to your job and you're new to this whole kind of world of community development block grant funds or any of the funds that are under the CPD program, I really recommend that you register for one of these one-on-one meetings so that we can kind of like just sit down and talk a little bit more and hopefully ease some pressure. But I do want to go to, we got a couple of questions related to coordinated entry as a referral. So the first question really is does coordinated entry have to be one of the referral methods utilized under HOME-ARP by a PJ?
No, it's optional.
Okay. Just go to the notice. We want to point you there. There are 3 referral like types that you can take a look at, but you are not required to use coordinated entry as a PJ. However, if you are planning to use your COC's coordinated entry, do you need to attach the coordinated entry policies and procedures to the allocation plan? This particular coordinated entry prioritizes vulnerability through the VI SPDAT in case consulting. So do we have to attach policies and procedures to our allocation plan?
I don't think it hurts, but it's not required. What you are required to do is in the referral methods section, talk about the methods of the preferences identified through coordinated entry, because like Kim said earlier, they inherently have preferences, and you also want to talk about the methods of prioritization that they use, that the coordinated entry system uses, if you are going to apply them. If you are not using coordinated entry, or you're using coordinated entry and other referral methods, and what you're doing is allowing coordinated entry to refer to a HOME-ARP waiting list, and then you're organizing that waiting list according to the preferences and method of prioritization identified by your HOME-ARP program, then you don't even need to talk about the coordinated entry preferences, but it's because you're applying them through your own waiting list. So it depends on what you need to talk about, depends on the referral method that you are choosing to utilize.
Hi, can I just jump in for a quick second? So I'm going to say that please don't attach the COC's, coordinated entry policies and procedures, because they're not relevant. They're not something that the rep in the field office are going to review. So please just include things that are actually profoundly relevant to reviewing and accepting the allocation plan.
Perfect. Okay. Two different questions in here. These are kind of going back to our allocation plan, but now we're shifting over to the gaps analysis and needs assessment. So this person wanted to just confirm their assumptions about the gaps analysis tables. So the table is assuming a formula is a gap equals the population minus the supply, and the numbers should match in the table. Is this true or false?
I'm not sure if I'm understanding exactly. There must be talking about the tables in the allocation plan template, which is a good plug for us probably to say that the allocation plan template is a very useful tool. So I guess what I would say is the allocation plan template is optional. You do not need to use that document, although we encourage you to, and you do not need to use every piece of it. So, I would just make sure that, if you're going to use the tables they have in the template, make sure that they're making sense to you. I'm not exactly sure about the actual way the tables are set up. I think your unmet needs and gaps might be more complex than what those tables can really describe. So I would be ready to provide whatever data, display the data in whatever way can sort of get at your unmet need and service gaps. And also to make sure that you're writing narrative. I think that's a big thing I want to say to folks about that section is don't just fill in the tables or create tables and expect them to do that work for you. You need to sort of be describing the story of each QP, what services exist for them now and what gaps there are. So I don't know if Elisa or somebody else knows about that exact question about the table itself, but.
I think in the question itself, I got a little lost on the formula that was mentioned, but I would reiterate what George said, that table was optional. What I would add is that it very much does not always tell the true story. I mean, we've worked with several communities, and shelter is a good example where it doesn't always actually show, the table itself is not showing the true story of what's happening in the community, because the table may show that there are excess shelter beds available. But what that table is not taking into consideration is the difference between maybe congregate versus non-congregate shelter beds, individual versus family shelter beds, So like George said, there you can adjust the table as you need. You also very much can and should in your narrative include all of the factors that are really impacting your gap and that are not showing up in that table.
And I'll answer these for you guys because you answered them already, but I'll just make sure I complete the full question. There was a second question about modifying the table, and would that offend HUD? Not at all. Modify the tables, add the information that data as you feel meets your community and really shows that picture of what the need is there. So go ahead and modify those, because like George and Elisa said, they're optional tables, but they are really a helpful way to organize the information and make sure you're getting all those questions answered. Okay. While I'm pulling up the next question, I did want to just drop in another resource available. I don't know if it's been announced on the HUD Exchange yet, but it is on the HUD Exchange. There are some resources on just sort of Homeless Services 101 about coordinated entry and HMIS for PJs. So I'm going to put that in the chat for you. It's a webinar, just a pre-recorded webinar. There's also going to be some crosswalks that are associated with that product. And so maybe that will help people kind of better understand coordinated entry as it exists in your communities today. So next question is really about kind of, we're getting to the finish line. I really am proud of this person. They're taking their allocation plan to their city council on March 14th. And when they did their analysis, they found that affordable rental housing was the greatest priority for spending, and then supportive services was second. The question is, if city council would prefer to allocate funding to other eligible activities or substantially change the amounts that are allocated, would HUD require more community process for a significant change from the published draft plan? Any takers?
I'm thinking through it. And
Yeah.
folks, please jump in. I mean, I think that I'm going to assume that you're asking the question because you have a reasonable assumption, or you feel like this may happen, or maybe it has happened in the past. I would say that in your allocation plan, like what you're putting funding towards should be based on the data and the results of your needs assessment and your gaps analysis, as well as your consultation process. So it's that being said, the assumption that you are putting money into rental housing and supportive services is that it's been justified through your needs assessment and gaps analysis. If city council comes back and says, they think there should be money in tenant-based rental assistance, I think what you would want to do is take a look at your data and see what your data tells you, and see if your data supports that need. Whether or not I think I'm kind of like hesitant to. I think that in most communities there is significant data to support any or all of the activities. So you also are taking, what you have to take into consideration, and maybe one of the conversations that you want to have with city council members is around your internal and external capacity for administering such projects or programs. So we've seen this in, I've had this conversation with a few communities where maybe there's a huge desire for non-congregate shelter, but when they really talk through what that means, the likelihood of that community really being successful and being able to adhere to all the HOME-ARP requirements that come with that activity decrease. And so the conversation moves to maybe we need to put money into supportive services instead. So I think those are some of the things I would go prepared to city council. So if those questions come up, you are prepared to answer them, to explain why why the funding is in certain activities and what you've taken into consideration that is data coming out of your needs assessment and your gaps analysis, as well as your kind of capacity assessment that you've done both internally and externally.
Yeah, I think that's well put, Elisa. So it would be, you know, a tough situation to sort of have that sort of feedback come from your council. But I think Elisa said this, and I would just second it, that like most of the eligible activities for most QPs are going to be needs in your community. Like most of these things are things that you could do in part of your allocation plan. What you should be doing is identifying what are the highest priorities among those needs, and that's going to correspond to what you want to fund. So there is a lot of need for all this stuff that HOME-ARP can do in everyone's community. And I think, like Elisa said, you know, you should be writing your plan to show to HUD these are the priority needs, and hopefully that's going to come out to your council as well, that like, yes, we acknowledge there is a lot of need out there in a lot of areas, but these are our priority needs.
Great. Thank you both. We have another question, and you know, this is why earlier I said we didn't want to cause any panic. So we've got some new people on here, just sort of new to their role. And the question was, I'm concerned whether I've gotten enough information from my consultation process. In fact, some of the agencies consulted seem to think I should have had all the information I needed without their input. Are there any research resources you can recommend for information that would help me get more information on a community level? I'm going to share the handouts, but you all can answer that. I'll put it in the chat, and then I'll share my screen for the needs assessment one, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think Jessica is going to share she's shared the link right now in the chat to these handouts, and I would definitely look at the one on the needs assessment and gaps analysis. It has it has ideas for publicly available data sources that are related to the QPs, which could be really helpful to you. She's sharing it right now, so that you can see those. So hopefully those can give you um, some ideas. I think so. I think I like that your consultation is gonna be hopefully informing some of this needs assessment and gaps analysis, like some of the data you can get. I think in whatever in your particular situation, it might be helpful to see if folks think that there's other data that should be available. Can they provide you with assistance on locating where that data is? I think in some cases, you know, for some of the QPs, there's a few examples of pretty commonly available data sources out there. You know, we have the homeless QP1 listed here with some data sources. We also always sort of really advise folks to try to work with their COC on the homeless data, because there's a lot of data that they collect in that homeless management information system that it might not be publicly available in the format that you need or specific to your PJ's jurisdiction if the geographic area isn't the same. But you might be able to get access to raw data through the COC, and be able to get more precise data that way. Yeah. Any other ideas from folks?
Well, if I could chime in, this is David from HUD. I would just say we're 6 weeks out. Don't get hung up in analysis paralysis, right? I mean, that's, you know, I think you really have got to look at this and say, you know, we've given it the old college try. We've gotten everything that we could pull together, and we're going to piece together something that shows what our community needs and that we can provide. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and I think that's great, David. And that sort of reminds me of another thing that is, you know, it's helpful to acknowledge your data gaps in your needs assessment and gaps analysis section. So if you are, if there was data that you weren't able to obtain, please be upfront about that and say, we weren't able to obtain this data because, the agency that collects it wasn't responsive to us. Just use what you can if there are data gaps, and then acknowledge what those gaps are and why you weren't able to address them. Describe your due diligence that you did to try to find that data, and yeah, and go with that. And I do think it's worth acknowledging, like, you want to be describing each QP, their unmet needs and their service gaps in as much detail as possible, but there are probably going to be some data gaps for some of the QPs in some cases. So just be very upfront about that.
I would just add that due diligence effort extends to the consultation process as well. So you've reached out and you've asked the questions, you've asked for conversation back. If the organization or the person is not being super responsive or is not interested, then I think in that consultation section you just indicate that, and that's okay. You just want to indicate who you've attempted to consult with all of the required groups. And like David said, don't get so kind of hung up on that you're not moving forward with the other sections of the plan. Because at this point, you really want to make sure you're moving forward with your needs assessment and getting the rest of the plan put together.
Great, thank you all. And that link to those handouts, the needs assessment handout is in there. There's also one on consultation, which I'll share really quickly. But, just is highlighting what Elisa just said, just some tips and tricks down here about what needs to be in your narrative. And then in the event that you have any kind of missing information, or, someone's not giving you feedback, just indicating that and making sure that you kind of move on to the next stages of this allocation planning process, because we really have not a lot of time left before you need to at least get something in to HUD. So we had just a quick question, and we are recording today's question session. Eventually it will be posted on the HUD Exchange for you to kind of go back and review. So we will have that available for everyone today. And we have just a little over half an hour left. I don't have I don't see any more hands or anything. I want to go back to one question that we didn't get to that was related to the preferences and some fair housing things. And so, we were having a conversation about non-congregate shelter and possibly some violations of the Fair Housing Act, doing a preference for females only. The question here was, if you had a preference for females, how does this affect a domestic violence shelter wanting to add some non-congregate shelter units? And I think George sort of said it best when we were talking about non-congregate shelter. We still can't limit that, despite the fact that domestic violence is often women who are victims of domestic violence. They're not always. And so a DV provider can't also do a preference for just female only survivors of domestic violence. And so, you're really going to need to reach out to that FHEO office in your community, have that conversation about, exactly what you're trying to accomplish, seeing if that is any violation of a fair housing issue. And then, to Kim's point, is when you're talking about this implementation in your policies and procedures, making sure that people have access to these resources as you have them in your community. But I don't know if anybody else, particularly HUD staff or anything, if there's been other conversations about domestic violence, QP3. Because I will say that QP3 does not just include survivors of domestic violence. It's human trafficking, labor, and all of that. So Kim, do you have any other thoughts on that kind of a question for DV?
Thank you so much, Jessica. Yeah, there's kind of a lot of good things to, you could follow up on. One thing again, just to call out, we have pulled out DV out of the homeless definition, or QP1, which is the COC definition, and you'll find DV is actually a component of homeless. So first of all, you don't have to be homeless to be, and a DV victim. You just have to be DV or human trafficking, whether it be sex or labor, stalking, and all that kind of good stuff. And the other thing that I want to say too is that, domestic violence, while there definitely is a preponderance, of victims that are identify as female, that there are DV victims of all sorts and types, even ones who don't necessarily identify sort of in the same general way that other people do. So that's why it's important that we keep this open, respectfully, right, to whoever it is who falls under that category. So that, just keep that in mind. Thanks.
Great. So if anybody has any other questions or things that have come up, please just put your question in the chat, or you can let us know in the chat that you'd like to come off mute and we can have you ask your question out loud. Give a few minutes for that. Otherwise, I'll kind of shift us to some things that we got in registration. So I just want to thank everybody for just, this dialogue today and really having a conversation. We know that preferences, limitations, this fair housing piece, all of this is really a lot to unpack. And so we're happy to be here to talk about that. One of the things that one of the questions that we got during the registration really relates to kind of preferences and limitations. And so I want to find that particular question. And it was, can we set limits for re-entry populations?
So, Kimberly, please weigh in, because I know you've had this conversation directly, but my understanding is that the reentry population potentially crosses all 4 QPs. So I think you could set like a preference or a limitation as long as you are not excluding any of the QPs. So in that limitation, you want to be thoughtful about, are you still providing access to all 4 QPs with your HOME-ARP program?
Yes, and the other thing that we're, considering here is that, we're not, there isn't, I mean, unfortunately, when we're talking about the reentry population, that could be men or women or non-binary, whatever, it doesn't matter that way. So, as long as we're not, limiting it to men, who are been through the reentry system, then we're okay. Or single adult households where, as opposed to families where a member was incarcerated. So as long as we just keep it to reentry, we're good. But when we start potentially getting into limitations around familial status or sex, other things, age, then we could run into some problems on the fair housing side.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just kind of add to that a little bit. I think some of that comes out in implementation when you start thinking more deeply about your referral methods and making sure that the referral methods that you're using to your HOME-ARP program are actually providing access to each QP, to all QPs.
I
We
think
got
it's
a follow-up.
also.
Oh,
Oh,
sorry.
sorry. I was just gonna say, I think so. I think the question was about a limitation for that subpopulation of each QP, and I think it's really worth at like anytime we're talking about limitations, it's worth stepping back and asking whether we could do this with a preference rather than a limitation. I think just for everybody writing plans, I my guess is that if you write in a limitation, there's going to be a higher level of review for what that says than for a preference, because a limitation is, inherently more restrictive than a preference. So I think it's just really worth asking yourself anytime you're thinking about doing that limitation, could we just do this as a preference?
And there was a follow-up question about about defining what do we mean by re-entry population. And so typically we don't, this came in as a question during registration, but I'm assuming that this was about people who were incarcerated and coming back to the community after incarceration. So we got another question about those the individual TA sessions. So we will be having some one-on-one opportunities, and I'll put that in the chat again, where you can meet with a provider. But there is going to be an opportunity, and we welcome and encourage you to submit your allocation plan if you're going to be coming to those sessions, so that the TA provider can review them ahead of time and really just walk you through, what it is that's in your allocation plan that might need to be adjusted or fixed, and take a look at it. So yes, you will have an opportunity to share your allocation plan if you do those one-on-ones. And we strongly encourage you to do that. And even if you're working with a consultant that you've hired, you can still request these and have another set of eyes on it. Sometimes, when you've been in this for months and months and months, it's easy to miss things. And so having a fresh set of eyes, could be helpful. So we encourage you to do that. So we got one more question. If we could talk a little bit about referral methods and a by names list. This person is saying, I have set a preference for chronic homelessness, but for fair housing, I don't want to use coordinated entry. So I think we can talk a little about the referral methods. By names list is a little different related to that. And then whoever asked this question, we may want to get some more context around the concerns that you have, the fair housing concerns that you have with coordinated entry. But anyone want to talk a little bit about those referral methods? I'll pull up an old slide deck too, if that will help you.
Well, I guess we can just start by saying that you have 3 options for referral methods. So the first one is to use coordinated entry as your referral method, but you need to expand it to make sure that it is that all QPs have access to it. The second option is to use coordinated entry in conjunction with other referral methods. And then your third option is just to use project or activity wait lists, where folks are the order that they're put into for access to the project or activity is chronological. So those are sort of your 3 options. And I don't really understand. Maybe this person, if they're on, could come off mute and talk to us about their fair housing concerns. But I think the thing with a by name list is a term that folks often use in a coordinated entry system. It's sort of the output of coordinated entry. It's a list of names that is ordered it's in a prioritized order based of those households based on whatever the prioritization or prioritization is for the coordinated entry.
George, if you mind if I jump in?
Sure, yeah.
it makes common sense to use coordinated entry, but I've been told that it doesn't align with the fair housing requirements. So I was just trying to find maybe a feeder method so that those on the by name list could access the program, but still in line with fair housing.
Okay. Was there any specific like reason that they said that the fair housing, like coordinated entry, would inherently be violating fair housing?
I think maybe it alluded to what you said. It doesn't represent all qualified populations.
Okay. Yeah. Um, so I think, I think this is just like a reality of like coordinated entry is a policy that it, comes down from a different HUD program, right? Through a different mechanism that has its own requirements. So it's something that's already set up in all communities. So I think folks see the value in trying to leverage this as part of their home ARP in some way. But I think just the requirement here is that there's pretty much I can't think of an example of which there's a coordinated entry system that would serve all the QPs now, and you could just take that and use it as your sole referral method. You would have to do work to make sure that all the other QPs get access to coordinated entry to where your output of coordinated entry, that by name list, is now, let's say, including all 4 QPs and not just the population that coordinated entry served before. So I think that, that's what you would have to do is sort of, expand coordinated entry to be able to have folks, go all the way through coordinated entry, even if they're in, let's say, QP4. I think, there is a middle ground, which is using coordinated entry and other referral methods. So that allows you to use coordinated entry as it's already set up for the folks who go through it, namely your QP1 population, also some folks in QP3, possibly QP2. But to have that there's another referral method as well with where folks from the other QPs can access your program that way.
In describing our referral methods, do we say we have 2 referral methods that covers all 4 populations? Do we have to narrate how we're sifting through? Do we take the first one first, or if we're creating a list and we have 2 referral methods, is it just first come first serve? How are we best describing our referral methods?
Well, I think that's going to probably depend on what your preferences are, right? Like if you don't have any preferences, then and you're just using coordinated entry to kind of take people from the QPs that it serves to help populate a wait list for a specific project or activity, then that's what you're going to say you're going to do, right? But if you are if you're trying to implement preferences, then you are going to have to describe how those decisions of putting some people before others would be made. Am I getting to the level of detail here that's helpful, or I don't know if Jessica or Elisa have more?
I think one clarifying thing would be that you're not required to describe your referral methods in the allocation plan. That's optional. The reason why we ask people to make sure that they're thinking about that, though, is that when you start considering coordinated entry, because coordinated entry as it is today inherently has preferences, you need to then describe in your allocation plan those preferences. So what's been happening is some communities have been saying, we're going to, we're going to use coordinated entry to fill all of the units in a homeless ARP or in a HOME-ARP rental program. And then they get to the preferences section and they say, we have no preferences. Well, that's not true because coordinated entry inherently has a preference. So just to be really clear, you do not have to describe it. a referral method in your allocation plan. But if you're considering using coordinated entry, you are going to need to describe your preferences and how your coordinated entry either is going to adopt the preferences that you've established or how you are going to be using your coordinated entries preferences and priorities. Does that help?
Yeah, Jessica, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, can I just jump in for a quick second too, Brian? I just wanted to again, Jessica did put up some resources because I think we really want folks to be very super clear that they understand how their local coordinated entry system works. So you know it very well, because we use the term in our notice expanded coordinated entry, okay? So you can't just, because yes, QP1 aligns with that sort of, but other than that, the coordinated entry does not adopt HOME-ARP qualifying population definitions. And in some COCs, they actually have a separate CE for domestic violence. So it's really going to be very important for you to know, the local lay of the land with CE and have those discussions with the continuum of care about how their CE works and how it could serve or doesn't serve, like with another referral method, to get to the folks that you want to have assisted in your HOME-ARP projects. Thank you.
And I put one more time, I put those the link to the handouts, because not only does it have the handouts that we were referencing, but the slide deck that I just showed, where it showed the 3 different referral methods, is also part of that, those resources there. And so there's a bit more detail in that particular presentation about referral methods, why coordinated entry inherently establishes a preference, and the need to expand coordinated entry so that the HOME-ARP qualifying populations are all accounted for, as if you're using that as a referral method. So we have 20 minutes left. Are there any other questions? I haven't seen anything else really kind of coming in, but if you want to, it looks like I see someone's hand, maybe Shannon just popped up. But if you also want to come off mute, just drop that in the chat. We're happy to answer any questions for you. But I think we can go to Shannon if that.
Okay. Thank you. And I'm Shannon, and I'm with OAHP with HUD as well. And I just wanted to comment on the referral methods and process. A lot of people, when they are working with having a preference for people experiencing or households experiencing homelessness, and maybe include chronicity as part of that as a method of prioritization or something along that lines. One of the ways that they can do that with a preference, and that has been discussed quite often, is to use the coordinated entry as one source, but use their method of referral to be coordinated entry and other referral methods. And that way they can utilize coordinated entries information, because a lot of people, coordinated entry is likely to come in contact with people who would meet that preference, people experiencing homelessness, specifically people who are chronically homeless. And so by using coordinated entry, you can do that. And then if you add a wait list as the other referral method, all other referral methods would go onto this wait list. And then at that point, if you're using both, then I think the question was asked, how would you determine which one's prioritized? You would have to identify in the plan that, it sounds like you're going to have a preference for chronically homeless individuals or households. Then those folks would be taken first off of the lists combined, but likely the wait list that's supplementing the coordinated entries list they've supplemented wouldn't necessarily meet that preference in time. But that way you're still not having a limitation. You're including all QPs, but there's going to be an easier access for people experiencing homelessness. I'm a little bit confused about the fair housing question component of that, and I think all of us who are providing a response to that had that question. But the idea is that everyone have access to be able to be on the list in order for that to work. The other thing I just wanted to point out is if there's a by names list or any pre-generated list that the coordinated entry currently houses, that doesn't constitute or translate directly over to a HOME-ARP wait list. So that would need to be, even if coordinated entry is used, it needs to be based on the HOME-ARP qualifying definitions, which are different.
That's a perfect segue for another resource that's now available on the HUD Exchange that I'm going to put in the chat. It's brand new, but it is a crosswalk looking at HOME-ARP qualifying populations and how they differ from ESG and COC populations. I think this might be a great resource to use when you're talking with your continuum of care about HOME-ARP and why you have to expand coordinated entry and who those qualifying populations are. So there's a resource there for you to kind of look at, like, what are those differences when you're thinking about your COC, ESG eligible participants, and then the HOME-ARP qualifying populations. So there's a lot of good information. All of this is on the HUD Exchange. I can't stress enough how great the HOME-ARP HUD Exchange is. Please take a look. There's some great gems on there if you are digging around and looking. We've got about 15 minutes left. I was just going to go through some other questions that we got through the registration, but of course, if things come up for you, put them in the chat or let us know you want to come off mute. I think today we probably answered this, but I'm going to just go ahead and put it out there. Any best uses of your HOME-ARP allocation, and what have other cities seen success in?
Well, I guess the short answer is the best use for your HOME-ARP allocation is what you figure out is the best use by writing your allocation plan. But no, I mean, I think it's hard to have a discussion about what is sort of the best use overall because every PJ is going to have unique circumstances. They're going to have unique unmet needs for these QPs and different services that already exist and then gaps in the available services. So, there really isn't an overall best use for your HOME-ARP out of the eligible activities. You're going to have to figure that out. That's what this is about, is identifying those priority needs. And so, that's what I would say, I think, is that's going to be different across each community.
I think that's fair. I think also this is a really new program, and I'm not aware of any programs out there yet that are like really bringing in information on success quite yet. So we do want to know you in the future if your community is doing a project. We want to hear about them, what they're like, what's going on, what are some of the things that you're seeing successes in. But HOME-ARP is pretty new for everybody. You heard how many PJs have yet to submit an allocation plan. So that means they have yet to get money to even start anything. We had a few questions in here in registration related to public comment period and public comment. Just maybe giving a little bit of how much detail do we need when we receive public comments? Just for the allocation plan, like what do we think we need to include to make sure we're meeting that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. You definitely want to summarize the comments you received. Like, again, this is going to look different for each PJ. But there are some PJs we've talked to who have said like, oh, we have hundreds of pages of comments. Should we put that as an attachment to our plan? And I think all the HUD staff would probably say, no, don't do that. You can summarize those comments. Also, if there are comments or recommendations that you are sort of not accepting out of hand, right? Like I think in a lot of cases, public comments are going to inform our overall need, unmet need, and service gaps that we have in our community, right? And those comments might not end up informing the activities that are funded, but we still took them into account in our overall development of our plan, right? But if there are comments that are sort of not being accepted, you should give the reason why they were not accepted. I think it's important to highlight any important comments that really had like a big influence on your plan as well. Highlighting, we weren't aware of this service that was unavailable to a certain QP, for example, until this comment was made. You really want to demonstrate as much as you can that you are not just checking the box on public participation, but that you are really like living out the spirit of it in the development of your plan. So anytime, document and put in your plan any efforts that you do to broaden your public engagement, to get more public comments, and then when those comments that you get actually, influence your plan, highlight them.
And I think a related question that we got, and it just very nicely leads into kind of this expanding public participation, but what are the required, this person used the term outreach, but what we were thinking they were talking about was public participation. What are the required outreach to disenfranchised populations?
Yeah, so I think when we got that question in registration, we were not quite sure if they were talking about like consultation in the consultation phase or outreach as part of the public participation process. So one of the things that we wanted to just make clear is that there is a difference between the consultation process and the public participation requirements. Consultation, it requires outreach and conversations with required groups that are outlined in the allocation plan. The public participation process is about connecting with the public in general and providing an opportunity for and encouraging citizen participation in the development of your allocation plan. And so I think that as part of, if you think about under the public participation umbrella, then the requirement is that you are encouraging participation from the general public, and knowing the purpose of HOME-ARP funds, it is helpful. And I would say potentially like falls under the category of best practice if you are specifically kind of outreaching to disenfranchised populations or groups that maybe fall into the QP definition, but it's not a specific requirement under the HOME-ARP notice.
Great. Is there someone else that wanted to comment there? Okay. So we have about 6 minutes left. I think it's a good time for us to start wrapping things up, maybe giving our group of facilitators, like if you've got any parting words or anything that you really want to make sure, based on today's conversation, that RPJs that are joining us today take away. And I'll also just add some additional resources here in the chat that I think will be helpful. One of which is the common issues that have been in allocation plans. I think this is a great resource as you're thinking about looking at your own allocation plan before you submit it, just to make sure that you have, you're not falling into any of those traps that people before you have. And then one more, which is been added and probably talked about a lot, but we have the HOME-ARP allocation plan template with tips. And so there's some great kind of tips and tricks as you go through each of the sections for you to consider. But Elisa, do you have any parting words for us today?
I think the thing that I want PJs to kind of understand is we get the overwhelm. The HOME-ARP notice is dense, and HOME-ARP funding is becoming available after 2-3 years of an influx of funding from different resources. And we also understand that many of you may be joining your PJ you maybe are new to the community development world or homeless services, or maybe you're coming from homeless services world and new to community development, or maybe you worked for your department for a while but doing something completely different, and now you've been moved over and are being asked to write this HOME-ARP allocation plan. And so we get that that's overwhelming. What I want you to kind of understand is that we don't want you to get so caught up in having a perfect allocation plan that you miss the opportunity to get your allocation plan in and miss the opportunity for funding in your community. So utilize the resources, reach out for direct TA, sign up for the one-on-ones, and check in with your field office. If you're really struggling, your field office can be a great place to kind of help you answer some of your questions, as well as the direct TA that's available to you. So just I would take a minute and try and identify really what's holding you up in your process, and then look to the resources to see how those resources can support that particular holdup.
George, any parting words?
I mean, I don't know if I can follow that up. That was kind of the big one there. So yeah, just y'all got this. We believe in you. You're gonna get this in. Just make sure you get your plan in by March 31st. That's the big thing here. But yeah, y'all can do it. Thanks for coming.
Kim, David, Martha, any parting words? Don't have to.
I would like to just throw in that there was a question earlier about what are the best HOME-ARP activities. And while there is no list, if there was a list, returning your funds to your state is definitely not on that list. So again, March 31st is coming up. Don't give the funds back. Don't give it to the state. Take care of your issues locally.
Yes, and just good luck, and we look forward to everyone submitting. And I get excited every week when I see the number increase, and we've got 352 more to go. So let's get them all in by March 31st, and I know we can do it. So yay!
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Again, we do have a few additional opportunities. This is our last kind of virtual session as a group of PJs. So we really do hope you got something out of it today, but there are opportunities for virtual one-on-one sessions. And I put that in the chat one more time, just in case, you want to meet one of us again, or maybe someone else on our team. And so we really look forward to it and look forward to supporting you getting this in on time. So thank you all for joining us.